Have you ever walked away without looking back, only to realize you left behind the most important thing? He was a Navy SEAL, strong, disciplined, a man who survived everything, except finding his way back home. Somewhere far from the city, there was a dog still waiting for him, day after day, as if he had never left. When they met again, there was no barking. Only recognition quiet, but undeniable. And then he saw the scar on its face. A mark from the days it had searched for him without giving up. Some things don't need explanations. Just one look is enough to know who never truly left whom. Where are you watching from? Like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 followers so we can share more meaningful stories. Now, let's begin. There was a kind of quiet that followed men home from war. Not the quiet of peace, not the quiet of rest. This one stayed closer to the skin, like a second layer no one else could see. It lived in the pauses between breaths, in the way a man stood still but never fully relaxed, in the way his eyes moved even when his body didn't. Soren Vale carried that quiet with him. At 35, he looked like a man who had never stopped being ready. He stood a little over 6 feet, his frame lean and efficient, built not for display but for endurance. There was no excess in him, no wasted motion, no softness that hadn't been earned. His face was clean-shaven, always, the sharp line of his jaw and the hard angles of his cheekbones left exposed, as if discipline itself refused to fade. His hair, dark brown, was cut short in a military style, though slightly longer than regulation would have allowed. It had grown out just enough to remind anyone who noticed that he no longer belonged to the system that had shaped him, but not enough to suggest he had truly left it behind. His skin had once been lighter. Now it carried the faint, uneven weathering of a man who had spent too much time under open skies, sun, wind, cold. His eyes were gray-blue, steady, unreadable at first glance, the kind of eyes that didn't judge, but didn't forget either. They held things. Too many things. Once, those eyes had known exactly where to look. Now they searched without finding anything to settle on. The apartment was small, not because it needed to be, but because Soren had chosen it that way. One room, one narrow kitchen, one window that looked out over a stretch of city street where people moved without noticing each other. The walls were bare. And no photographs, no decorations, no traces of a life being lived, only evidence of one being maintained. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a duffel bag in the corner. Everything arranged in a way that suggested departure was always possible. Soren sat at the table, a cup of black coffee cooling untouched in front of him. The steam had faded minutes ago, but he hadn't noticed. His hands rested flat on the surface, fingers relaxed, but still, as if waiting for a signal that never came. Outside, the city had begun its morning routine. Cars moved. Doors opened and closed. Someone laughed too loudly on the sidewalk below. Life was happening. He watched it without interest, not because he didn't understand it, because he no longer knew where he fit inside it. There had been a time when every day had structure, clear objectives, defined roles, decisions made under pressure that left no room for hesitation. Back then, Soren had known exactly who he was, a Navy SEAL. A man trusted to move first, to act, to decide, to carry weight that others couldn't. Now there was no team, No orders. No mission waiting at the edge of the day. Only time. Too much of it. And no direction for where to put it. He stood eventually, more out of habit than purpose. Movement was easier than stillness. Stillness gave the quiet too much room to expand. He crossed the room in a few steps, pulled on his worn work boots. The leather creased, edges scuffed from use, and grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. The tactical combat shirt he wore had faded into a muted olive gray, the fabric softened by time, edges worn where it had rubbed against skin and gear. Beneath it, the dark red thermal layer held warmth close to his body. It was the only thing he wore. The only version of himself that still felt consistent. He stepped outside. The air was colder than he expected, carrying a sharpness that cut clean through the lingering warmth of the building. He inhaled slowly, letting it settle into his lungs. What cold had always made things clearer. He walked without choosing a direction, through streets that all looked the same after a while, past storefronts that opened and closed without meaning, past people who glanced at him briefly, then away, sensing something in him they didn't want to interrupt. He moved with purpose, even without a destination. That was something he couldn't unlearn. At some point, he found himself near a park. Not large, not remarkable. Just a stretch of green that had survived the city's need to build over everything else. He slowed. Watched. There was a man sitting on a bench, maybe in his 40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket too light for the weather. Beside him, a golden retriever pressed against his leg, tail moving lazily against the wood. The man reached down, scratching behind the dog's ear. The dog leaned into it. Completely. No hesitation. No calculation. Just trust. Soren stopped walking. Something about that moment held him there. But not because it was extraordinary. Because it wasn't. It was simple. And somehow, that made it harder to look away. The dog lifted its head suddenly, not toward the man, toward Soren. Their eyes met. It wasn't fear, wasn't curiosity. The dog simply looked at him, long enough to register, long enough that something inside Soren shifted, subtle but undeniable. Then the dog stood, took a step forward. The leash tightened slightly, stopping it from moving any further. But for a moment, just a moment, it felt like the distance between them had closed, as if the dog had recognized something, or someone. The man laughed softly, pulling the leash back. "Easy," he said. The dog sat again, but it didn't look away immediately. Soren exhaled slowly, and kept walking. He didn't think about it at first, or at least he told himself he didn't. But the image stayed. The weight of that look, the way the dog had moved without hesitation, the absence of doubt. He returned to his apartment sometime before noon. The room felt the same as it had that morning. Still, empty, waiting. He set his keys down on the table, the small metallic sound echoing slightly in the quiet space. Then he stopped. Something wasn't right. Not in the room, in him. He turned slowly, scanning the space. Nothing had changed. Everything was where he had left it. And yet, there was a feeling, not of something missing, of something left behind. The difference was small, but important. He moved toward the kitchen drawer without thinking, pulled it open. Inside, beneath a few scattered tools and unopened mail, his fingers brushed against something familiar. Leather. Worn. He stilled, then slowly lifted it. A collar. Dark brown, edges cracked with age, the metal ring dulled from time and use. For a moment, he didn't breathe. The room seemed to narrow around that single object. Memory didn't return all at once. It came in fragments. A shape, a movement, a presence, a dog, not golden, not soft, stronger, sharper, eyes that didn't just look but understood. He closed his hand around the collar. Tight, as if it might disappear if he didn't hold it firmly enough. Time shifted. Not forward, not back. Just unsettled. There had been a reason he had left, a reason he had walked away from everything that had tied him to something real. It had made sense then. It had been necessary. But standing there now, in a room that held nothing except the outline of a life, the reason felt smaller, less certain. He sat down slowly. The chair creaked under his weight. The collar rested in his hands, the leather warm now from contact. He stared at it for a long time. Long enough that the light outside began to change. Long enough that the city's noise shifted from morning to afternoon without him noticing. There was a thought. It didn't arrive fully formed. It didn't announce itself. It simply settled, quiet, persistent. He knew where the dog was, or at least where it had been. The last place he had seen it. The last place he had chosen not to return to. He reached for his phone, paused. For a moment, his thumb hovered above the screen. Not because he didn't know what to do, because he did. And that made it harder. He pressed call. Elias Vale answered on the third ring. Yeah. His voice was the same. Rough. Grounded. Unchanged by time in a way that most things weren't. It's me, Soren said. A pause. Then, I know. No surprise. No questions. Just recognition. They didn't speak about the past. Didn't need to. Some things didn't require explanation. If you're tired, Elias said after a while, his tone even, steady. Come home. That was all. No pressure, no expectation, just an open door. Soren looked down at the collar in his hand, at the faint marks where teeth had once gripped it, and at the place where the leather had worn thinner from years of use. Something inside him shifted again. This time, deeper. Not discomfort, not uncertainty. Something closer to direction. I'll come, he said. A simple answer. But it carried weight. On the other end of the line, Elias exhaled once. Drive safe. The call ended. The room felt different now. Not fuller, not warmer, but no longer empty in the same way. Soren stood, moved with purpose for the first time in longer than he could measure. He packed quickly. Not much to take. He had never built a life here that required leaving anything behind. The duffel filled easily. Clothes, essentials, the watch, and finally, the collar. He placed it carefully inside. Outside, the sky had begun to shift toward evening. The light softened. The city moved on without noticing his departure. That was fine. It had never really held him anyway. Soren paused at the door, one hand on the handle. For a moment he stood still. Not because he was hesitating, because he was aware of the choice and of the direction, of the fact that whatever waited on the other side of that drive was something he had once left behind. He opened the door, stepped out. And this time, he didn't feel lost. The road north did not welcome travelers. It simply allowed them. It stretched long and quiet beneath a pale sky, cutting through land that had learned to exist without asking for attention. Pines stood in patient lines, their dark silhouettes unmoved by wind or time, while the last traces of winter clung stubbornly to shaded ground. Soren Vale drove through it all without turning on the radio. There was no need for noise. The silence suited him better. It matched something inside him, something that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be filled. The further he drove, the less the world resembled the one he had left behind. Buildings gave way to distance, distance gave way to space, and space gave way to something harder to define. Not emptiness, something older. The kind of place where time did not move faster or slower, and it simply moved without permission. By the time the lake appeared, the light had shifted. Afternoon leaned toward evening, softening the edges of everything it touched. The water stretched wide and still, reflecting the sky in muted tones of silver and blue. Thin sheets of ice lingered along the far edges, refusing to fully surrender. Soren slowed without realizing it. The sight of it did something to him. Not memory, not exactly. Recognition. Briar Glen rested along the curve of that lake. A small village. Quiet. Unchanged in ways that mattered more than appearances. Houses spaced apart, not for privacy but for breathing room. Smoke rose in thin lines from chimneys, dissolving into the cold air. No one rushed here. Nothing needed to. The gravel road that led to Elias Vale's house had not improved. Soren felt each shift beneath the tires, each uneven stretch reminding him that this place had never cared much for convenience. While the house came into view slowly, white paint worn thin by weather, porch leaning slightly to one side, windows reflecting the pale sky as if holding on to it. It looked smaller than he remembered, and somehow more real. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat. For a moment, he did not move. Not because he was unsure, because something in him needed to settle. The collar rested in the pocket of his duffel, quiet and constant. He had not taken it out since packing it. He did not need to see it to know it was there. Some things did not require confirmation. The wind moved lightly across the yard. The trees shifted. The world held its breath. And then, something moved. It came from the side of the house. Fast. Low. Uncertain at first glance, like a shadow deciding whether to become real. Soren stepped out of the car just as it reached him. The impact wasn't violent, but it was immediate, solid, alive. He staggered half a step back, and then looked down. The dog stood there. German Shepherd. 5, maybe 6 years old. Lean but strong, in the way that spoke of endurance rather than neglect. His coat carried the natural blend of sable cream, gray, and black, shifting together without pattern, catching the fading light in quiet variations. His ears stood upright, alert. But it was his eyes that held everything. Amber. Clear, steady, and fixed entirely on Soren. There was no barking, no hesitation, no confusion. The dog stepped forward once, then again, until the distance between them no longer existed. He pressed against Soren's leg, not aggressively, not desperately, just certain, as if confirming something that had never truly been in doubt. Soren did not move. For a moment, his body forgot how. The world narrowed. Not to danger, to presence. Then his hand lifted. Slow, deliberate. It hovered just above the dog's head for a fraction of a second, long enough to feel the weight of everything that had not been said, and then it settled. The fur was thicker than he remembered. Warmer. Real. The dog leaned into the touch. Not cautiously. Not testing. Fully. As if the years between them had not existed. Soren's fingers stilled. Something caught his attention. A break in the pattern of the dog's coat. A line. Subtle, but unmistakable. A scar. It ran along the left side of the dog's face, cutting through the sable fur in a pale, uneven mark where hair grew thinner. Not fresh, not raw. Healed, but not forgotten. Soren's hand moved slightly, brushing along it. The dog did not flinch, did not pull away. He simply stood there, accepting the touch, as if the pain that had left that mark belonged to a time that no longer mattered. Soren's jaw tightened. The story behind that scar did not need to be told yet. It was already understood. "You took your time." The voice came from the porch. Elias Vale stood in the doorway. Age had changed him, but not enough. He was still broad through the shoulders, though time had carved weight from him, leaving behind something leaner, more deliberate. His hair, once dark, had faded fully into silver, worn slightly longer than most men his age would allow. A short beard framed his jaw, uneven but maintained, giving him the look of a man who did not care for precision unless it served a purpose. His face carried lines, deep ones, not from worry, from weather, from years of standing where others would have turned away. His eyes met Soren's, calm, steady, unmoved by the passage of time between them. Soren exhaled once. "Road hasn't changed." Elias nodded. "It doesn't." That was all. No questions. No welcome speech. Just the acknowledgement of presence. The dog stepped back slightly. Not away. Just enough to look between the two men, as if placing them in the same space again. Inside, the house held the same quiet weight it always had. Wood. Coffee. Something faintly sweet in the background. Everything where it belonged. Everything unchanged in ways that made change feel unnecessary. Soren set his duffel near the wall. The collar remained inside. For now. The dog followed him in. Not at his heels. Not leading. Just near, close enough to feel. Far enough not to demand. They sat at the table. Coffee was poured. Silence settled. Not empty, not heavy. Just present. "He stayed," Elias said after a while. Soren did not ask who. He already knew. Elias nodded toward the dog. "He waited." The words were simple, but they carried something beneath them. Something older than explanation. Soren's gaze dropped. The dog lay near the doorway now, head resting lightly on his paws, eyes half closed but not asleep. Never fully asleep. Not yet. "He thought you'd come back sooner," Elias added. No accusation. No weight. Just fact. Soren's hand tightened slightly around the mug. The heat grounded him, kept him in the moment. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, and nothing did. The dog lifted his head again, looked at Soren, not asking, not expecting. Just there. And for the first time since stepping out of the car, Soren understood something he had not allowed himself to fully face before. The dog had not been left behind. Not in the way he had told himself. He had been waiting. Not because he didn't know how to leave, but because he had chosen not to. Soren leaned back slightly in the chair. The wood creaked under his weight. The room held steady. The world did not shift. Nothing dramatic happened. No moment of realization that changed everything at once, just a quiet understanding. Settling. Slow. Unavoidable. Some things did not break when you left them. They stayed. And in staying, they became something else. Soren looked at the dog again. Really looked this time. At the scar. At the posture. At the way he existed in the space, without asking for anything. Mara, he said quietly. The name settled into the room like it had never left. The dog's ear flicked, his gaze sharpened. But he did not move. Not yet. Not because he didn't recognize it, but because he had already known. Morning did not arrive loudly in Briar Glen. It unfolded the way frost melts quietly, almost unnoticed, until suddenly the world is no longer what it was a moment before. Light slipped through the old windows of Elias Vale's house, pale and patient, touching the edges of the room before settling across the wooden floor. Dust moved in it, slow and unhurried, as if even the smallest things here had learned not to rush. Soren was already awake. He sat at the edge of the bed, boots planted firmly on the floor, shoulders slightly forward, not tense, not relaxed, but balanced somewhere in between. His body had remembered the place before his mind had fully caught up. Across the room, Mara lay near the door, not sleeping, not watching, just there. That was the difference Soren noticed first. The dog did not hover, did not press close, and did not demand. He existed in the same space without needing to claim it. Elias was outside by the time Soren stepped onto the porch. The older man stood near the woodpile, one hand resting on the handle of an axe that had seen more years than either of them cared to count. His movements were slower now, but not uncertain. Each motion carried intention, as if time had stripped away everything unnecessary and left only what mattered. "You're up," Elias said without turning. Soren nodded once. "Didn't sleep bad." "That'll change," Elias replied. Not a warning, a statement. The air carried a different kind of cold than the city. Cleaner, less forgiving. It settled into the lungs without resistance, forcing the body to acknowledge it. Soren stepped off the porch. Mara followed, not beside him, not ahead, just within reach. They walked through the village without announcement. No one called out. No one approached directly. But Soren felt it, the subtle shift of attention, but the quiet acknowledgement that someone who had been gone had returned. Not curiosity. Recognition. The first place Elias stopped was a workshop near the edge of the village. The door stood open. Inside, the smell of wood and oil hung in the air, thick, but not unpleasant. It was the scent of work that had been done for years without needing to be explained. A man stood at a bench. He was older, mid-60s. Maybe more, but there was nothing fragile about him. His frame was broad, though age had carved weight from it, leaving behind something dense and grounded. His hair was white, pulled back loosely, and his face carried deep lines that did not come from comfort. His left sleeve was pinned neatly just below the elbow. The arm was gone. Not recently. The way he moved told Soren that much. He had learned how to exist without it long ago. "Caleb," Elias said. The man glanced up. His eyes were sharp. Yet they settled on Soren for a moment long enough to measure, not long enough to judge. "Thought that might be you," Caleb Turner said. His voice was rough, worn down by time, but not weakened. Soren inclined his head slightly. "Been a while." Caleb shrugged. "Long enough for people to forget how long it's been." There was no bitterness in it, only truth. Mara stepped forward slightly, not toward Caleb, toward the space between them. He paused, sat, calm, present. Caleb's gaze flicked downward. "Still got him," he said. Soren didn't answer. He didn't need to. The workshop told its own story, tools worn from use, not neglect. Wood stacked carefully, each piece cut and placed with purpose. Nothing wasted, nothing left unfinished, without reason. Caleb worked with one arm the way other men worked with two, not compensating, adapting. That was the difference. "Roof held through the last storm," Caleb said, adjusting something on the bench with practiced precision. "But it won't hold forever." Elias nodded. "Nothing does." Soren glanced at the beams overhead, measured, assessed. His body understood what his mind had not yet decided. Work needed to be done. They moved on. Not because the conversation ended, because it had said what it needed to. The village stretched quietly around them. Each house carried signs of use, not wear. Fences leaned slightly but stood. Windows held light even when the sky dimmed. Nothing was perfect, but nothing was abandoned. They stopped next, near a small structure close to the lake. A woman stood outside, hands steady as she examined a dog resting on a wooden table. Her movements were precise, controlled, but not clinical. There was care in them, not soft, not indulgent, intentional. She looked up as they approached. Martha Hale. Her name came back to Soren slowly, like something half-remembered. She was in her early 50s, tall in posture, if not in height. Her frame lean from years of work that required endurance more than strength. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, strands escaping where they chose. Her face carried lines, but not from age alone, from focus, from attention, from the kind of care that does not allow distraction. Her eyes settled on Mara first. Not Soren. Not Elias. The dog. "You brought him back," she said quietly. Not a question. Soren held her gaze. "I didn't take him anywhere," he replied. A faint shift in her expression. Not quite a smile. Something closer to understanding. Mara approached her without hesitation. Not eager. Not cautious. Familiar. She crouched slightly, her hand moving to his face, fingers brushing along the scar with the kind of care that came from knowing exactly where pain had once lived. "He healed well," she said. Soren's jaw tightened slightly. "He shouldn't have," she added, almost to herself. "Not with how deep it was." Mara did something then that he had not done since Soren arrived. And he didn't stand still, didn't lean into the touch. He shifted, subtle, but deliberate. He moved his head just enough to guide Martha's hand not away from the scar, but along it, tracing its full length, as if showing her, as if reminding her. Her fingers paused. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition. "He remembers," she said softly. Not to Soren, not to Elias, to herself. And for a moment, just a moment. The air between them changed, as if the scar was not just a mark of survival, but something that still held meaning. Martha stood slowly. "He stayed near the edge of the village for days after it happened," she said, her voice steady again. "Wouldn't come inside. Wouldn't rest." Soren didn't ask what it was. Not yet. They left her there. The lake behind her stretched out in quiet reflection, untouched by the weight of what had been said. As they walked back, and Soren noticed something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. This place wasn't waiting for him. It had never stopped. The people here, they didn't need saving. They didn't need direction. They simply endured. And in that endurance, there was something stronger than anything he had known before. Mara walked beside him, closer now, not guiding, not following, just there. Soren glanced down at him, at the scar, at the steady rhythm of his movement, at the quiet certainty in every step. For the first time since arriving, he didn't feel like the one who understood the situation. He felt like the one still learning. There was a difference between surviving and continuing. The people of Briar Glen did not speak about it, but it showed in the way they moved through their days. Nothing they did carried urgency. Nothing they did was careless. Every action, no matter how small, seemed to belong to a larger rhythm one that did not depend on recognition or reward. Soren Vale noticed it before he understood it. It was in the way Elias repaired a loose hinge without announcing it, in the way Caleb adjusted his grip on a tool, not compensating for what he had lost, but adapting to what remained, in the way Martha moved between animals, her hands steady, her attention complete. No one here waited for things to break completely. They fixed them while they still held. The morning air was colder than the day before, not sharply so, but enough that it lingered in the bones. Frost clung to the edges of the yard, turning the grass pale and brittle underfoot. The sky remained clear, but there was a weight to it, something subtle that suggested change would come again, sooner than expected. Soren stepped out of the house just after sunrise. Mara followed. Not close, not distant. Present. That was the word Soren had begun to associate with him. Not loyal, not obedient. Present. Elias stood near the fence line, one hand resting on a post that leaned just slightly out of place. "Wind's been working this side," he said, glancing over his shoulder. Soren nodded. "I'll fix it." Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. The fence ran along the edge of the property, separating the yard from a stretch of uneven land that sloped gently toward the lake. It wasn't meant to keep anything out. It was meant to define space, a boundary, something that said, "This is where we stand." Soren crouched near the base of one of the posts. The wood was worn, but not rotted. The nails had loosened, the ground beneath it shifting just enough over time to tilt the structure out of alignment. It hadn't broken. It had simply stopped holding properly. He worked without thinking. That was the way his body functioned best. Hands moved, measured, adjusted. The hammer felt natural in his grip. The rhythm of impact metal against metal, wood settling into place, gave shape to something that did not require words. Mara moved along the fence line as Soren worked. He didn't wander aimlessly. He checked, paused, observed. At times he would stop at a particular section, nose close to the ground, as if reading something invisible. Then he would move on. The sun rose higher. Light spread across the land, softening edges, revealing details that had been hidden in shadow. Soren stood, stretching slightly, and then moved to the next post. The work continued. Quiet. Unremarkable. Necessary. Footsteps approached. Not hurried. Measured. Soren didn't look up immediately. He waited. Listened. The rhythm was unfamiliar, but not threatening. "You've still got the hands for it." The voice was rough, edged with something that might have been humor once, though it had worn thin over time. Soren turned. Ryan Hale stood a few yards away. He had changed little from what Soren remembered, but what had changed was not immediately visible. His frame was lean, but not from discipline. More from neglect. His shoulders slouched slightly, as if he carried something that never fully left him. His hair, once neatly kept, now fell unevenly, pushed back without care. A light beard covered his jaw, not thick enough to hide the structure beneath, but enough to suggest he had stopped paying attention to details. His eyes were the part that stayed with Soren. Blue, but dulled. Not from age, from something heavier, something unresolved. "Didn't expect to see you back," Ryan added. Soren straightened slightly. "Didn't expect to come back." Ryan huffed a quiet breath. "Yeah, that sounds about right." Mara approached slowly. Not directly. He circled slightly, placing himself within Ryan's awareness without forcing contact. Ryan noticed. His gaze dropped. For a brief moment, something shifted in his posture, subtle, but enough for Soren to register. Not fear, not discomfort. Recognition. "Dog's different," Ryan said. Soren glanced at Mara. "How?" Ryan shrugged. "Knows more than he should." Mara stopped. Not near Soren. Not near the fence. Near Ryan. He stepped closer, his movement slow, deliberate. Not cautious. Intentional. Ryan stiffened slightly. "Hey," he muttered, half under his breath. Mara didn't react to the sound. He continued forward until he stood directly in front of him. Then, he sat, perfectly still, his gaze fixed, not on Ryan's face, on his hands. Ryan's fingers twitched, barely noticeable, but enough. The moment stretched, the air shifted. Something unspoken passed between them, something neither of them chose to acknowledge. Ryan exhaled sharply. "Dogs don't forget things," he said. It wasn't clear if he meant Mara, or something else entirely. Soren watched the exchange without interrupting. There were things here he did not understand yet, but he recognized the shape of it. Tension. Not immediate. Not explosive. Something quieter. More dangerous. Ryan stepped back, breaking the space. "Anyway," he said, brushing his hands against his jeans as if removing something that wasn't there. "Good to see you didn't lose everything out there." Soren didn't respond. Ryan didn't wait for one. He turned, walked away. Not quickly, but not slowly either. Just enough to suggest he preferred distance. Mara remained where he was, watching, not following, not reacting, just observing. Soren returned to the fence. The work wasn't finished. And out here, unfinished things didn't stay that way for long. The hammer fell into rhythm again. Impact. Adjustment. Alignment. The post straightened. Held. By midday, the section was complete. Not perfect, but stable. That was enough. Soren stepped back, wiping his hands against the worn fabric of his pants. Mara moved beside him. Closer now. Not pressing. Just within reach. They stood there for a moment, looking out over the land, the lake beyond, the trees shifting gently in the wind. There was something about this place. It didn't demand change. It didn't force anything. It simply allowed things to settle. Soren exhaled slowly. The breath carried something with it. Not relief. Not yet. But something close. He glanced down at Mara. The dog met his gaze. Steady. Unwavering. For the first time since returning. Soren understood something he hadn't been able to see before. This place wasn't trying to fix him. It didn't need to. It was simply giving him space to hold. And in that space, something inside him had already begun to change. The forest near Briar Glen did not feel dangerous. It simply felt honest. There were no clean paths here, no guarantees beneath each step. The ground shifted where it wanted to. Roots broke through the surface without warning. Patches of old ice hid beneath leaves that had not yet learned they were no longer part of winter. It was a place where hesitation mattered. And so did instinct. Soren walked the trail without speaking. Not because he had nothing to say, because there was no need to fill the space. The air held a quiet weight, the kind that made sound carry differently. Even the smallest movement, the snap of a twig, the shift of gravel felt amplified, as if the forest itself was listening. Mara moved ahead of him. Not far. Never far. He did not rush. He adjusted. Each step placed with care. What his body reading the terrain in ways Soren understood but could not replicate. That was something Soren had begun to notice. The difference between control and awareness. The trail narrowed as it descended slightly toward a lower ridge. The lake was somewhere beyond the trees. Unseen, but present, its stillness pressing quietly against the edges of the land. Soren slowed, not out of caution, out of recognition. This was not a place to move quickly. They had not planned to come here. There had been no task assigned, no request made. Soren had simply followed the pull of something that did not require explanation. And Mara had followed him. Or perhaps he had allowed Soren to follow him. They moved for several minutes before the silence changed. Not broken. Shifted. There was a difference. Soren stopped, his head tilted slightly, listening. There. Faint. A sound that did not belong to wind or movement through trees. Something lighter. Uneven. Mara heard it too. His posture changed instantly. Not tense. Not alarmed. Focused. He turned his head, ears angling toward the source, body aligning with something Soren could not yet see. Then he moved. Soren followed. No hesitation. No need for confirmation. The dog did not wander. Did not search. He tracked. Direct. Certain. They found him near the edge of a shallow incline. A boy. Alone. Standing too close to ground that did not hold well under pressure. He was young. 10, maybe 11. Thin in a way that did not come from weakness, but from a body still trying to decide how to grow. His hoodie hung loose around his shoulders, sleeves pulled slightly over his hands. His hair was light brown, unevenly cut, as if someone had done it quickly without caring about precision. His face was turned away at first, but when he shifted, Soren saw his eyes. Gray-blue. Not unlike his own, but softer and distant in a way that did not belong to someone that young. "You shouldn't be here," Soren said. The boy didn't react immediately. "Then." "I know," he replied. His voice was quiet, too controlled. Mara approached slowly. The boy did not step back. He did not step forward either. He simply watched. "You're Owen," Soren said. The boy nodded. "Yeah." There was something in the way he stood, not careless, not unaware, but disconnected, as if the world around him existed at a slight distance from where he stood. "You come out here a lot?" Soren asked. Owen shrugged. "Sometimes." Not an answer, but not a refusal. Mara sat beside him, close, but not touching. The boy's hand moved slightly, brushing against the dog's fur. Mara didn't react, didn't lean in, didn't pull away. He accepted it. And for a moment, everything held. The ground shifted. Soft at first, then more. The edge of the incline beneath Owen's feet loosened just enough to change its shape. Soren saw it. The angle. The balance. The way weight would pull forward before the body could correct. He moved. But Mara was already there. Not faster. Earlier. The dog stepped into the boy's path, his body cutting across the angle of movement, forcing Owen to adjust his stance without thinking. The boy stumbled. Backward. Away from the edge. The ground beneath where he had been standing gave way seconds later, sliding downward in a quiet collapse of dirt and loose stone. Silence followed. Not the absence of sound. The absence of what could have happened. Owen stared at the space, then at Mara, then at Soren. His breathing changed. Not panic. Awareness. "I didn't see it," he said. Soren nodded. "You're not supposed to." Mara remained where he stood, between the boy and the edge. Not guarding. Positioned. Soren stepped closer. Careful. Measured. "You're coming back," he said. Owen didn't argue. He simply nodded. They moved together. Slower now. The forest no longer felt quiet in the same way. Not threatening, but aware. Mara stayed beside Owen, closer than before. Not guiding, not directing, matching. Soren watched it, as the way the dog adjusted his pace, the way he shifted slightly when Owen's steps became uneven, not correcting, not interfering, just present where needed, present. The difference was subtle, but undeniable. They reached the edge of the village just as the light began to shift toward afternoon. The air warmed slightly, though the cold still lingered beneath it. A woman stood near one of the houses, waiting. She moved the moment she saw them. Fast, controlled. Her posture held tension, but not panic. She had already prepared herself for something worse. "Owen!" Her voice broke slightly, but she didn't stop moving. Sarah Hale. Mid-30s. Her frame was lean, not from neglect, but from constant motion. Her hair was dark, pulled back loosely, strands falling free as if they refused to stay contained. Her face carried the kind of exhaustion that came from responsibility, not weakness. Her eyes, sharp, protective, and tired in a way that did not fade with sleep. She reached Owen in seconds, and hands on his shoulders, checking, confirming. "Where were you?" she asked. You don't just disappear," she said, her voice tightening. Then she stopped, looked at Soren, then at Mara. Recognition, not of the man, of the dog. "You found him," she said. Soren shook his head slightly. He found us. She nodded once, accepted it. Her hand softened on Owen's shoulder. The tension didn't leave, but it shifted. "Thank you," she said. Simple, direct, heavy. Soren didn't respond. He didn't need to. Mara stood beside Owen, not moving, not leaving. For the first time since Soren had returned, he saw it clearly. The connection. Not to him. To the boy. And something inside him, something he had carried for years, shifted. He had spent so long believing he needed to be the one who acted first, the one who moved, the one who held everything together. But here, in this moment, he wasn't the one who had made the difference. Mara had. And somehow, that did not feel like losing something. It felt like being allowed to let go. The storm did not announce itself with thunder or sudden darkness. It gathered slowly, like a thought forming at the edge of awareness, something felt before it was understood. The air grew heavier through the afternoon, the wind shifting direction in uneven currents that pressed against the trees rather than moving cleanly through them. Briar Glen noticed. Not with fear, with memory. Soren stood near the side of Elias's house, reinforcing a loose section of the outer wall. The wood resisted slightly under his hands, swollen from cold and damp, but it still held. It just needed guidance pressure in the right places, strength applied where it mattered. His movements were efficient, but his attention had drifted outward. He kept glancing toward the sky, reading it without realizing he was doing so. What years of training had taught him to anticipate change before it arrived, to understand patterns in motion before they revealed themselves fully. Mara stood several steps away, angled toward the open land beyond the yard. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't restless. But something in him had shifted. His ears moved in small, precise adjustments, tracking sounds carried from a distance. His posture carried quiet tension, not fear, but readiness. Elias stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth that had seen better years. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He looked at the sky for a long moment, then at the trees, then at the lake beyond them. "It's turning faster than it should," he said. Soren glanced at him. "Storm?" Elias nodded once. "It won't be gentle." That was enough. No one in Briar Glen waited for storms to prove themselves. Preparation began immediately. Not loud, not frantic. Just movement purposeful, practiced. Doors were secured, tools were brought inside. At loose boards were checked, then checked again. The kind of work that did not draw attention to itself, but made all the difference when pressure came. Soren moved through it naturally. His hands found tasks without needing instruction. He checked the windows, reinforced the latch on the back door, secured anything that might shift or fall under force. The rhythm returned to him, not the urgency of combat, but something steadier, something grounded. Mara stayed close now, closer than he had been since Soren arrived. He followed not out of dependency, but alignment. His body adjusted to Soren's movement, always within reach, always aware. By the time the storm arrived, the village had already done what it could. The rest was no longer theirs to control. Wind struck first. It hit the house in sharp, sudden bursts, rattling the structure as if testing its limits. The trees bent under its force, their branches moving in violent arcs, leaves and debris pulled into motion without direction. But the sound filled the air, pressing in from all sides. Rain followed quickly, driven at an angle that made it seem less like falling and more like being thrown. The world beyond the windows blurred, then disappeared entirely behind shifting gray. Inside, The house held. Elias lit a lantern when the lights flickered and failed. The warm glow pushed back against the dimness, giving the room shape again, though the shadows still moved in ways that made everything feel less certain. Soren stood near the window, watching the storm without focusing on anything specific. It wasn't fear that held him there. It was familiarity. He understood chaos. He understood pressure. But this was different. There was no opponent here, no objective to secure, no clear way to influence the outcome, just endurance. Mara stood in the center of the room, still as before, but his attention had sharpened. Was his head turned slightly at intervals, listening beyond the walls, beyond the wind? He wasn't reacting to the storm itself. He was listening for something inside it. The knock came without warning, not loud, not repeated, just a single, sharp sound against the door, nearly lost in the noise outside. Soren moved first this time, crossing the room in a few steps and opening the door just enough to see through the rain. Sarah stood there. Her hair clung to her face, soaked through, strands darkened by water. Her jacket hung unevenly, one side partially unfastened, as if she had dressed in a hurry without noticing. Her breathing was uneven, her shoulders tight with tension she could no longer contain. "Is he here?" she asked. Her voice didn't carry panic. It carried something worse. Fear held tightly in place. Soren didn't need clarification. "Owen?" She nodded quickly. "I checked the house. He's not there. I thought—" She stopped, swallowing whatever came next. "He wasn't anywhere." Behind Soren, Mara moved. He didn't wait. He didn't look for permission. He stepped past Soren, out into the storm, lowering his head slightly as the wind pushed against him. For a brief second, he paused, just long enough to orient himself, then turned sharply and moved in a single direction. Not searching. Knowing. Sarah stared after him, her breath catching. "He knows where to go." Soren grabbed his jacket. "Stay here," Elias said from behind him. Soren didn't respond. He was already moving. Outside, the storm hit harder than it had seemed from within the house. The wind resisted every step, forcing him to lean into it just to maintain balance. Rain soaked through his clothes almost immediately, cold cutting through fabric and skin alike. But Mara was ahead. Not far enough to lose sight, not close enough to slow him down. Soren followed. The path into the trees was barely visible now. What had been clear ground earlier had turned slick and uncertain. Each step required attention. Each shift in weight mattered. Mara adjusted without hesitation. He didn't fight the storm. He moved with it. They reached the edge of the forest, where the wind broke unevenly against the trees, creating pockets of relative stillness between bursts of force. Mara turned sharply, moving off the main trail into denser ground. Soren followed without question. He trusted the dog, more than he realized. It didn't take long. It never does when something is truly found. Owen lay near the base of a tree, partially shielded from the worst of the wind. His body was curled slightly, one leg extended at an angle that spoke clearly of injury. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but steady. "Mara found you," Soren said quietly as he crouched beside him. The boy's eyes opened slightly, unfocused at first, then settling. "Yeah," he whispered. Mara stood beside him, not touching, but positioned in a way that made his presence unmistakable. Soren checked quickly, pulse, breathing, responsiveness. The boy was conscious, stable enough to move, but the leg would not support weight. "We're going back," Soren said. He lifted Owen carefully, adjusting his weight across his shoulders. The boy winced, but didn't resist. Mara moved ahead again, slower now, guiding rather than leading. The return felt longer, not because of distance, because of responsibility. Each step mattered more. Each movement had consequence. The storm did not ease. But Soren no longer noticed it the same way. His focus had narrowed. Forward. Steady. Controlled. When they reached the edge of the village, Sarah was there, waiting where the trees gave way to open ground. She moved toward them immediately, stopping just short as she saw Owen. Relief broke across her face, raw and unfiltered. "He's okay," Soren said. "Legs hurt." She nodded. Was her hands already moving to check him, her voice softer now, steadier? "We've got you," she murmured to her son. Inside the house, warmth returned slowly. The storm remained outside, pressing against the walls, but it no longer felt like the center of everything. Mara settled near the doorway again, his body relaxed now, his attention no longer searching. Soren stood in the room, watching the space settle around him. For years he had believed that control defined strength, that being the first to act, the one to decide, the one to carry the weight, that was what made him necessary. But today, he had followed. And it had been enough. He looked at Mara. The dog met his gaze briefly, then lowered his head, as if the moment required nothing more. For the first time in a long time, Soren felt something shift inside him. Not loss, not relief, something quieter. He was no longer the only one holding the line, and maybe he never had been. Morning did not rush its way into Briar Glen after the storm. It returned carefully. The sky cleared in slow layers, the gray lifting just enough to reveal pale blue beneath it. The wind had quieted, though it still lingered in occasional movements through the trees, like something reluctant to leave completely. The ground held the memory of rain-darkened earth, softened edges, the scent of wet wood and cold air settling into everything. The village did not celebrate the end of the storm. It simply continued. Soren stood on the porch, one hand resting lightly against the worn railing. The wood beneath his fingers was still damp, rough where time had worn it down. He watched the land in front of him without focusing on anything specific. There was damage. Small things. A section of fence leaning farther than before, and a broken branch near the edge of the yard. Loose boards along one of the outer sheds. Nothing catastrophic. Just reminders. The kind that said, "This place holds, but it is not untouched." Behind him, the house moved quietly. Elias walked slower this morning, but not because of exhaustion. He moved as he always did. Steady, deliberate, conserving effort where others might waste it. He poured coffee into a mug, set another on the table without asking, knowing it would be used. Soren stepped inside, taking the mug with a slight nod. "Roof held," Elias said. Soren glanced upward instinctively. "Yeah." Elias took a sip, then added, "It usually does." There was no pride in it, just fact. Mara lay near the doorway. Not asleep. Never fully asleep. His body rested, but his awareness remained intact, his ears adjusting subtly to the smallest shifts in sound. Soren looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Something had changed. Not in the dog, in the way Soren saw him. Later, and the village began to move, not as a group, not as a reaction, as a continuation. People stepped outside, assessing what needed to be repaired, what could wait, what could be left alone. Conversations happened in passing, brief exchanges that carried more meaning than longer discussions elsewhere. No one assigned tasks. They simply did what needed to be done. Soren found himself walking toward the fence line again, not because someone asked, because it was there, because it needed attention. Mara followed. Not immediately. A few seconds after. A choice. They worked in silence. The hammer found its rhythm again. Wood shifted under pressure, settling back into place where it belonged. Soren's movements were smoother now, less deliberate, as if his body had accepted the work not as a task, but as part of something ongoing. Footsteps approached from the side. Light. Careful. Not uncertain. Just aware of each step. Owen. But he moved slower than before, his injured leg supported with uneven weight. The bandaging held, but his body had not yet forgotten the pain. His hoodie hung loosely around him, sleeves still pulled slightly over his hands, as if he preferred the small barrier between himself and the world. He stopped a few feet away. Watched. "You shouldn't be out yet," Soren said. Owen shrugged lightly. "I didn't want to stay inside." There was no defiance in it, just truth. Mara turned his head. Not quickly, not sharply. He looked at the boy, then stood. He moved toward Owen, slow, measured, not closing the distance completely. Just enough. Owen shifted his weight slightly. Mara adjusted, matching, without instruction. They stood like that for a moment, side by side, not touching, but connected in a way that did not require explanation. Owen took a step, too fast, too confident. His injured leg faltered. The shift in balance happened too quickly for correction. Soren moved instinctively, but he stopped, because Mara had already moved. Not in front, not behind, beside. He positioned himself exactly where Owen's weight would fall, his body absorbing the shift without force, without disruption. Owen steadied. His hand came down, gripping the harness instinctively. Mara did not flinch, did not resist. He held, perfectly still. The boy's breathing slowed, his grip loosened, and for a brief moment, the space between them held something more than balance. Trust. Not given. Recognized. Soren watched. Something in his chest tightened slightly. Not from tension, from understanding. Mara stepped away. Not abruptly. Not as if the moment had ended. As if it had been completed. Owen looked at him, then at Soren. "He does that," the boy said quietly. Soren nodded. "I know." But he didn't. Not fully. Not until now. The work continued, but something had shifted. Soren found himself moving less as the day went on. Not because there was nothing to do, because he no longer felt the need to fill every moment with action. He stood back more often. Observed. Watched the way the village functioned without instruction. Watched the way Mara moved between spaces, not tied to him, not waiting for direction. That was the difference. Before, Mara had stayed close. Not out of need, out of choice. Now. He moved freely. He followed Owen for a time, then wandered toward the edge of the yard, then returned. Not checking. Not reporting. Existing. Soren sat on the porch steps as the afternoon light softened. The lake reflected the sky in muted tones, the surface calm again, as if the storm had never existed. But it had. And it had changed things, even if those changes were not immediately visible. Elias joined him after a while. He sat without speaking, his presence as steady as the ground beneath them. They watched in silence. "You leaving?" Elias asked eventually. The question did not press, but it did not demand an answer. It simply existed. Soren looked out at the water, at the trees, at the village, at Mara. The dog stood near Owen again, not guarding, not waiting, just there. For years, Soren had believed that leaving was the only way forward, that staying meant stagnation. That movement defined purpose, but here, nothing rushed, nothing chased, nothing demanded more than what could be given. "I don't know," Soren said. Elias nodded. "That's all right." The answer settled. Not incomplete. Not uncertain. Just open. The light dipped lower, shadows stretched. The day moved toward its end without resistance. Soren stood slowly. Not because he needed to go somewhere, because he wanted to move. Mara lifted his head, watched him, then stood. This time, he didn't wait. He walked beside Soren. Not ahead, not behind. Beside. And for the first time, it did not feel like one was leading the other. It felt like something simpler, something quieter, something that had been there all along. Two lives, no longer out of step. At the end of this story, nothing extraordinary happened in the way the world usually defines miracles. There was no sudden rescue from the sky, no voice that spoke in thunder, no moment that forced belief. And yet, something changed. A man who had lost his direction found a reason to stay. A dog who had every reason to move on chose to wait. A quiet village kept holding together, one small act at a time. Maybe that is how God works most of the time. Not in the loud moments we expect, but in the quiet ones we almost overlook. In the loyalty that refuses to break. In the second chances we didn't think we deserved. In the gentle push that leads us back to where we were always meant to be. Sometimes, the miracle is not that life becomes easier. The miracle is that we are not alone while we carry it. If this story meant something to you, take a moment today to notice the small things around you, the people who stayed, the love that didn't leave, the quiet strength that has been holding you up all along. Share this story with someone who might need that reminder. Leave a comment and tell us where you found your own moment of grace. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that heal, stories that stay. And may God watch over you, guide your path, and give you the strength to keep going, even when the way forward is not clear.